Man, aren't vampires awesome? I have been a lover of vampires for what it seems like my whole life. When it comes to the classic gothic horror monsters that we all know and love, I must say that vampires have always taken the cake for me. Werewolves are a close second. But I don't know, man. Werewolves have a unique connotation these days in the modern meme era of the internet. What the hell am I talking about? Werewolf fetish has been around for years. Vampires are cool, they're powerful, they're seductive. Well, I say they're even more than seductive. I think they're downright sexy. Vampires and sex are almost synonymous in a way. Their bloodlust is often compared to the sexual lust that a lot of people have for each other. Spoken rule about vampires that seduction and sexuality are part of their nature. So that's what I want to talk about today. Just how did vampires and sexuality become so connected to each other? Well, I assure you, the answer isn't as straightforward as you think. So, my dear viewers, sit back, relax, as I take you through a journey through blood and sweat, as we talk about vampires and sex, a match made in hell.
Now I'm going to split this video into a couple of sections as we explore what vampires do in the shadows. First off, we're going to talk about why vampires have this sexual connotation in the first place. Next, we'll go over some examples from the time period where vampire media started to become a thing, which is in the 19th century. And finally, we're going to explore how the changes in how society views sex changes how vampires are portrayed as well.
Vampires and sex. What the fuck is up with that? Well, vampires have a few connotations of things that they represent. A lot of the time, especially when tales and folklore of vampires from Eastern Europe came to Western European countries like England and Germany, those stories were told to have people fear the bad blood coming from the East. Vampires represented disease and being sickly, but the sexual angle came from the societal standards of Western European countries. Vampires and vampire-like creatures have almost always had a sexual connotation to them, because more often than not, these creatures of the night push the boundaries of what sexuality even is. They push the taboo of sex to its extremes, in each country that they appear in.
In ancient times, the demon Lilith from Mesopotamia and Lilith from Jewish mythology were women who were cast out of heavenly places. In the case of Lilith, she was Adam's first wife before Eve, but after she was cast out of the Garden of Eden for not being subservient to Adam, she became the queen of the demons. Talk about an upgrade, right? While she was the queen of the demons, she would often go out in the middle of the night and feed on the flesh and blood of young mothers and their babies. She would also seduce young men into sexual relationships and would keep them under her control for eternity. Lilith is a clear example of a figure who is pushing against the moral and sexual standards of the time that her story was being made. In ancient times, women were seen as property to men, whether that be a daughter being the property of her father or a wife being the property of her husband. Women took the submissive role while men took the dominant role. But in the story of Lilith, and many of the other stories that we get to later on, the positions are reversed to showcase what can happen if women were in control of their sexuality.
This idea hasn't really changed much in the Victorian era. Women were still seen as property and sexuality was still as repressed as ever. On the outside looking in, sexual practices were only seen in the context of marriage and having children. This conservative mindset kept the discussion about sexuality under wraps, never really rearing its ugly head that much. Doesn't mean people still weren't fucking though, because they definitely were. In ages of repression, pushing the boundaries of sexual taboo shouldn't be that surprising to hear about. And in no place was this more apparent than in books and novels, especially books and novels about vampires. Like I said before, vampires push the boundaries of sexual taboo and societal standards. And if you read these stories, it's really not that hard to see why.
For example, on 1819, the short story The Vampire was created. Written by John Polidori, many say that is the first vampire story ever to be written. Before, stories were either word of mouth or were written in poetry, but never in a full story.
The vampire tells the story of Lord Ruthven, a noble aristocrat who takes on a young wealthy man named Aubrey so he can travel the world with him. But as they travel together, it seems that Lord Ruthven is a lot more than what meets the eye. Lord Ruthven definitely is the progenitor of the suave, charismatic vampire noble who seduces people into feeding off of them. This is one of the first times where the act of feeding on another person is seen in a sexual connotation. All of the women that Lord Ruthven feeds on throughout the story, he has a sexual relationship with. From the young woman that was a mutual acquaintance of Lord Ruthven and Aubrey, to by the end of the story, actually Aubrey's sister, who Lord Ruthven was set to marry. After consummating the marriage, Lord Ruthven then drains her of all of her blood. and Aubrey then finds her later on, with Ruthven never being seen again. The idea of the vampire bite being seen in a sexual way will be explored even deeper in later stories. Also, the idea of female virginity being corrupted, which is featured very heavily in this story. With all of the women Lord Ruthven feeds on being virgins, and after defeating, fucking. Those women are never heard from again. This Victorian idea, which has stuck with us until this very day for some reason, that virgin women are pure and women who have sex are dirty and sullied, plays a major factor in vampire lore and sexuality. In this story, all of the feeding has been heterosexual in nature, with Lord Ruthven feeding on women. But what about relationships who aren't on the straight and narrow, if you catch my drift?
Enter Carmilla. Written in 1872 by Sheridan Le Fanu. Carmilla is the first vampire story to showcase a homosexual relationship being the main focus, mainly focusing on Laura and her relationship with Carmilla the vampire. Now, in the Victorian age, lesbians were never really thought of as a thing, so this story was certainly transgressive for its time.
The story of Carmilla, as she seduces Laura over many years, pulling her back in every time to feed on her, was certainly made with titillation in mind, but also to push the boundaries of what is sexually acceptable. Much like Lilith before her, Carmilla is a strong and deeply sexual being who is dominant over the people she's in a relationship with, especially over Laura. Throughout the story, we see how Carmilla dominates Laura sexually in order to feed off of her, more often than not, forcing herself upon Laura so that she gets what she wants. This is very commonplace in a lot of vampire stories, where the bloodlust and the sexual lust sort of combine together. This becomes much more apparent if you notice the metaphor of the vampire bite being like sex. Carmilla feeds off of multiple women in the story, some living, some not. This idea of a sexual woman who dominates other women sexually must have been a shock to the system to the readers back in those days. But that was kind of the point for a story like this back in the day. Alright, it's time to talk about the big dog, the OG, the one you've all been waiting for, my man Dracula.
His fangs and lick up the blood. Like this. See? Scrape and lick. Scrape and lick.
Not that Dracula. I love that Dracula though, he's very funny. Everyone go watch Billy and Mandy, by the way. But no, we're talking about this Dracula.
Dracula, written by Bram Stoker in 1897, was a novel about the titular Count Dracula, who was inviting guests over to his house for dinner and a look around his castle. Among the people he invites is Jonathan Harker, an attorney who Dracula takes a very special interest in. The rest of the story is a tale of fear, seduction, and bloodshed. Dracula is a very interesting book, because like many of the other stories I talked about before, Dracula is a representation of taboo sexuality. This is especially apparent when Dracula feeds not only on women, but men as well.
That's right, Dracula is our very first bisexual vampire. Yay! Woo! Dracula, like Lord Ruthven in The Vampire, is charismatic and seductive, turning up the charm in order to get what he wants out of people, that mainly being their blood.
While Dracula is very seductive and often forces himself on many of his victims, with the character of Lucy, he slowly drinks blood from her every night until she is turned into a vampire. Dracula also feeds on Jonathan Harker's wife, Mina, in a forceful, pretty much as-ang of Mina, as he also forces her to drink his blood so that she is completely under his control as well. Focusing a bit on Lucy now, Lucy is now a vampire, and after this change, she changes a lot as well. Before the bite, she was a shy, cute, and most notably for a story like this, a virgin. After Dracula fucks on Lucy, she's a lot like Dracula. She's much more dominant and sexually active. She has 3 suitors after her, and she has them wrapped around her little finger and uses them like playthings. She's also like Carmilla in that way, a femme fatale of sorts, taking whatever she wants. And she's not the only one. 3 vampire women who live in Dracula's castle are seen as his wives, and in one scene are about to feed on Jonathan, and Jonathan pretty much submits to it, changing the general dynamic of society at the time, where now the women are the dominant ones, and Jonathan the man is submissive, and is being penetrated by the women. All he would have been had Dracula not stopped them, claiming that Jonathan Harker is his and his alone. Yes, this is where the bisexuality of Dracula is on full display, because he wants to dominate and feed, on Jonathan Harker himself. Though he never does bite Jonathan, he has full control over him, seeing Jonathan as his property, much like how women were seen as property back in those days. He has a similar relationship with his assistant Renfield, who Dracula completely dominates and uses as a tool. Renfield is completely devoted to Dracula, and actually really enjoys being submissive to him, showcasing the control Dracula has over him. Dracula is one of the most interesting figures in vampire lore, not only because of his cunning and his charisma, but also for how he represents sexuality in a time that was so sexually repressed.
At the beginning of the 20th century, vampire media started to be created even more and more, from novels to films. The allure of the vampire was still very strong, and nowhere can we see that better than in the film Nosferatu. Nosferatu was released in 1922, which is over 100 years ago at this point. Now, Nosferatu was pretty much just a retelling of Bram Stoker's Dracula, with the names of the characters changed. But this still does not change the fact that Nosferatu, or Count Orlok as he is known in the film, is still a very sexual creature.
The film emphasizes the disease aspect of vampirism in a lot of ways, especially when Count Orlok moves into a new house and all of his neighbors come down with a plague. As Count Orlok and Thomas Hutter get closer together, the sexual connotations become more apparent. For most of the film, Count Orlok is feeding off of Thomas in his sleep, with Thomas just shrugging it off thinking that they're mosquito bites. Much like Dracula and Jonathan, Orlok and Thomas represent a same-sex relationship, with Thomas being under Count Orlok's control. But something very interesting happens at the end of the film. In order for Count Orlok to be defeated, it is written in the book that if a pure-hearted woman were to give herself willingly to the vampire could be defeated. So our main heroine of the film, Ellen, Thomas's wife, chooses to sacrifice herself to Orlok. As the sun rises, Orlok turns to dust and Ellen is saved. What's interesting about this ending is that it's different from the ending of Bram Stoker's Dracula. This time the woman is actually the hero in the end. But on top of that, the ending of Nosferatu can actually be read in two ways. First being that Ellen distracted Orlok by giving herself over to him, and Orlok being exposed to the sun is what actually kills him. Or you can read it as Ellen with her pure virgin blood willingly giving herself over and performing a heterosexual act is what actually kills Orlok. Throughout the entire movie, Orlok has only been feeding on men, and as we know through other vampire stories, a vampire bite is analogous to sex. So Orlok was actually in, as society would see at the time, in perverse homosexual relationships. But when Ellen gives herself over to Orlok, him feeding on her is a heterosexual relationship. And Orlok engaging in a heterosexual act with a pure woman is what actually kills him. It's a pretty interesting thing to think about when you put it into those terms. Kinda makes the ending more ambiguous than we may have initially thought.
The eras after Nosferatu put vampires in a very interesting light. In 1931, the first real adaptation of Dracula was released. The titular count was played by Bela Lugosi, and he became a very popular figure after this film came out. He played Dracula in a very flamboyant and charismatic way, even more so than in the book. While the film isn't as sexualized as the book, it still showcases Dracula as a suave and domineering figure. The same cannot be said about the 1958 version of Dracula, however. This Dracula, played by the incredible Christopher Lee, was a lot more like the book, where the violence and sexual nature of the story was on full display. The dominating and overpowering force that was Dracula was still very frightening, but also still sexy in a way. This film and Christopher Lee showed this fearsome character to a whole new audience, so they can all see the violent sexual nature of Dracula at full force. Alright, from then on, things started to change not only for the vampire, but for society as well. The sexual revolution of the 60s, in tandem with the widespread availability of birth control, sex slowly but surely became not only seen as something that you do in order to have kids and start a family. Now sex was seen as something that you can do for pleasure as well. This is something that the vampire stories of the past were kind of hinting at, having sex for the sake of fulfilling your lust only. With sex being seen as a more casual thing now, vampire stories are able to be even pushed even further, so that they can explore certain types of taboo sexual acts. Queer relationships in vampire media started becoming even more of a popular trend. Homosexuality was not fully accepted back in those days, but it can further be explored now that they were sort of more out in the open. Books like Interview with a Vampire and Salem's Lot were both stories with vampires that had open same-sex relationships in them. This was certainly boundary pushing for the time. But like I said before, homosexuality was not very commonly talked about. Another thing that started to change about vampire stories is that the vampires started to be seen as a more sympathetic character. Vampires actually have real thoughts and emotions rather than being just bloodthirsty, seductive monsters. Well, they were still seductive as hell, but they were a lot nicer about it. You can especially see this in various erotic and romance novels that featured vampires. Instead of a vampire by being seen as a dominant sexual act, it was seen as more of a compassionate, sometimes even gentle sexual act. In books like the Dracula Tape series, for example, or even Interview with a Vampire, like I just said, the vampires were a lot more loving than bloodthirsty in those books. But all of this would come to a head in the 90s when a little known show, I doubt you even heard about it, came out, called Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Buffy the Vampire Slayer was actually a very interesting show, and it definitely pushed a lot of boundaries with how it portrayed sexuality. In the 90s, homosexuality was actually becoming a bit more accepted in past decades. Still not fully accepted, but you get the idea. The 90s was an era of transgression, and you can definitely see that in how the different sexualities were portrayed in media. And Buffy the Vampire Slayer was no different. Spike, one of the main vampire characters of the show, is portrayed in a not so subtle queer way, where his alluded to bisexuality is on full display. Obviously, of course, we have Willow and Tara paving the way for how lesbian relationships will be portrayed in media ever since. The vampires in Buffy are also still very sexual beings. Characters like Angel, Spike, and the various evil vampires that Buffy and the crew fight along the way all have that very Dracula-like dominant sexuality that characterizes vampires. But also the vampires in this show are humanized and are seen as compassionate, like the 70s and 80s erotic vampire novels. Spike is a clear example of this, with him being one of the kinder vampires in the show. Buffy the Vampire Slayer went a long way in normalizing characters in same-sex relationships, and bringing the sexualized nature of vampires to a new light.
In the modern age of 2000 and beyond, this fascination with vampires and sexuality hasn't really changed much at all, but the way certain writers have gone about portraying some of these things has changed, leading to some great and not so great results. Let's start with everybody's favorite vampire book series, Twilight. The ways that vampires and sexuality are portrayed in these books are really weird to say the least. Hell, how they portray vampires in general is really weird. But to stay on theme, how sexuality is shown in these books are kind of like how sexuality is shown in other vampire stories. But then again, not really. The reason why I say that is because Twilight's vampires are kind of like vampires with a chastity belt on. Or cage if we're going 2023 with it. I know what you people do. But anyways, the reason why I say that is because the vampires in Twilight don't really have sex, like, at all. Edward throughout the entire first book is pining after Bella, constantly having to keep himself in check so that he doesn't bite her. And if you've been following this video so far, you know that vampires don't do that, like, at all. Twilight is definitely trying to portray vampires in a more humanizing light, and I totally get that. They seem to go even further with it than those romance novels that I talked about earlier. At least in those books, the vampires still have sex. In Twilight, Edward only has sex with Bella in the third book after they get married. This is completely antithetical to everything we know about vampires. Vampires push the boundaries of sexuality, not follow conservative guidelines about sex after marriage to a T. But yeah, sexuality in Twilight, very strange, and not super vampire-like.
In comparison to this, the True Blood books and TV series portrays vampires and sexuality pretty much as it should be, with them pushing the boundaries of taboos. But one really overlooked aspect of True Blood is its metaphors and allegories, and how those metaphors are, unfortunately, broken at every turn.
The whole theme about True Blood is that vampirism in the story is a metaphor for homosexuality. It's pretty simple to see that with the underground bars and the blatant discrimination against vampires, and the overt queerness of a lot of the vampire characters in the story. But this metaphor quickly breaks once you realize that vampires are bloodthirsty monsters who drink people's blood. In a scenario like that, where there is a group of monsters living in your town, yeah, I think it's kind of fair not to want to be around them. Now granted, the show goes out of its way to try and justify this metaphor, and it does a pretty alright job at it, but I'm sorry man, every time I think about this show, I just can't help but to think that yeah, I wouldn't want bloodthirsty monsters to be around my town too. For an example of how vampires push the boundaries of sexuality for its time, we have to go to a really cool example from anime and manga, and that show being Hellsing. Hellsing is a different kind of vampire show for a different kind of vampire.
The show is about Alucard, who was once known as Dracula, the most powerful vampire around. But he disappeared and went into hiding for hundreds of years, until a little girl named Integra finds him and shows him what true strength is. Ever since that day, Alucard swore his loyalty to Integra and now works for her, as she leads a secret organization to hunt down and kill vampires, with Alucard leading the charge. When it comes to sexuality, however, this show explores the dominant versus submissive aspect that a lot of vampire stories have. But instead of Dracula being dominant, Dracula is the one actually taking the orders, and he likes it. Alucard in Hellsing is simply just way too strong, and will destroy any opposition without a second thought. So to make things fun for himself, he places certain restrictions upon his powers, and the only way he can lift those restrictions is if he gets permission from his master Integra. I'm sure people can see the sexual parallels of what I'm talking about. In order for Alucard to blow his load and go all out killing all of the opponents in his way, he has to beg his master for release. I think they literally call it a release in the show, like I'm not kidding. Alucard isn't even a brat about it either. You can tell that he loves being under submission, that he loves to beg and plead for his release. Hellsing is a great show for a lot of reasons, but this is certainly an interesting tidbit that I'm sure most people don't even think about when watching the show.
Woo! Well, that was fun. I know there were a ton of examples that I missed, and I'm really sorry, but there's a ton of vampire media out there. But to get back on theme, vampires are sexy. But they're sexy with a purpose. That purpose is to expose the dark underbelly of sexuality and to push the boundaries of what kind of sexuality is acceptable. Things like dominance and submission, slave and master, LGBTQ relationships, and many others are explored in our favorite vampire stories. It sort of gives people who relate to these things an outlet to explore their own sexual proclivities. Hopefully shedding a light on this will allow people to explore those things as well. Well, that's going to be enough for me. Make sure you like and subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff. And I'll see you around for something completely different. Peace.